Hello, global gardeners. Happy Monday. Happy St. Patrick's Day. Happy start to another wonderful gardening week. We're getting so close to spring being here, and I can't believe it's taken this long. You might not be able to hear it, but I can. It is howling outside. The wind is blowing. And of course, that means here in Colorado, I have more snow on the way. But spring is just around the corner. And I know I'll actually be able to get plants in the ground soon. I hope you're doing well if you're actually at that stage that you can get plants in the ground. And if you're like me, still waiting, it's still giving you opportunity to learn, to plan, and to prepare. Today, I want to talk about bad gardening advice because when we take that time to learn and plan and prepare, often we look for help. We look for some information. We look for those tips and tricks. And I know a lot of you are looking at the Gardener Scott channel for that. There are a lot of other channels with great information. But what I find, because I watch a lot of YouTube gardening videos, is that there is bad advice out there. And trying to figure out what's good advice and what's bad advice can be a challenge. Even for me, I'll see stuff online. I've been gardening for more than 3 decades. I'm a master gardener for 20 years. And I'll see something and think, wow, I wonder if that works. Rather than just assume it works, I take the extra steps to see if there's some research, see if any studies have been done to find out what the backbone is to that advice. Is it worth anything at all? And I'm surprised by how much advice gardeners give each other, and they don't even realize that it's not necessarily bad because it's being given in a helpful way, but it's not useful. And maybe it just achieves nothing at all. And those are the kind of things I want to talk about today. I want you to ask me about advice that you've received to see if maybe it's good advice or bad advice. And even if it's something necessary to try in the garden. I want to start with one that you can see debunked throughout the YouTube world. All of those gardeners that you probably are trusting, Epic Gardening, me, Black Gumbo, Simplified Gardening. There are so many of us that have done videos where we debunk some of the myths, some of these tips and tricks that really end up being bad advice. And one that all of us know is eggshells to cure blossom end rot. And so if you've got your tomatoes and you get blossom end rot, and all of us either have had it or will have it at some point, you look it up and you see blossom end rot is a calcium deficiency in the tomatoes. The solution to that, of course, is to add calcium, right? So you see the advice that says to pour milk around your plants because, of course, milk has calcium in it. And more likely, you're going to see the advice to put eggshells around your tomatoes or to bury an egg in the hole when you plant your tomatoes. Eggs are loaded with calcium, right? So that must be a good answer. Well, when you look into the science behind it, the calcium in an eggshell is in a completely different form than plants can use. So yeah, there's calcium in it, but it's not the calcium that you really want to be giving to your plants. And if you look at the soil science, you'll find out that virtually all soil on our planet has enough calcium in it to support the growth of plants. It's really the formation of the fruit on the tomato and when the calcium is brought up into the plant. And the soil needs to be moist. The calcium needs to be given the opportunity to go into the plant through the roots. And the roots need a moist soil. If the soil is too dry or the soil is too wet, then that calcium isn't uptaken by the tomato plant. And that's what is the most likely cause of blossom end rot is inadequate watering, too little or too much. When you fix that problem, you suddenly realize that you don't need eggshells. You don't need to bury an egg around your tomato plants. And so what ends up happening, I think, and this I've said many times, it's one of my basic credos that a good garden grows where a good gardener goes. And so if you recognize that your tomato is having blossom end rot, you're now going to focus more on your tomato plants. You're going to go to your garden, you're going to tend to your tomato plants, and maybe you're making that extra effort to add eggshells. Well, by adding that extra effort and by having that focus on your tomatoes, you're more likely to water correctly. You're not going to just go out there and turn the hose off or set it on automatic timer and hope everything is right. You're worried about your blossom end rot. You're worried about your tomato plants. And so you're doing more things right. The calcium is just kind of one of those things in the background. And so many of these tips, this advice that ends up being questionable, I think starts that way. It might have a foundation in some valid reasoning, but it's really the fact that the gardener is doing so many other things right, and then trying to develop a causal relationship because they added the eggshells, that it becomes bad advice. It becomes unnecessary. It becomes something that really is ineffective. And so I'm starting a test this year just to help substantiate some of the studies and the research. I'm going to bury some eggshells, and I'll come back next year, and I'll come back in 2 years, and I'll come back in 3 years, and those eggshells are still going to be there in 3 years because eggshells will not break down in the soil where I live. If you have an acidic soil, the eggshells might break down a little bit faster. But in my neutral to alkaline soil, the eggshells aren't going to break down. So when we look for that extra information, when we look at the science and the research, you may find that some of these tips and tricks really don't carry much water in the bucket, so to speak, as we're going out to the garden. It's the water in the bucket that is actually making the difference in our garden. And so, shout out to everybody, of course. I see that Jay is here, our fantastic moderator. I haven't heard anything from Heidi, so I hope Heidi is doing well. She wasn't with us last week. So, Heidi, if you're watching this on replay, we miss you and we hope you're doing well. Bowtie Life in the Garden says, good morning to all of us. The worst advice I have seen the most of this year is people planting so early they can't handle the sizes of the seedlings before soil warms enough. And this is a great example. And thank you for sharing this idea. So I garden in Colorado, and my season is short. I can't even put plants in the ground in my garden pretty much until June. There are a ton of videos out there from gardeners that live in Southern California, Florida, Texas, that are saying right now what they can do in their garden. Well, that's because I'm in a much colder climate than they are, that I'm not doing it. It has nothing to do with the calendar. It all has to do with your climate, the region you're in, when your last frost date is, and what kind of plants you're starting to grow. And so you're exactly right. You see some of this good advice for some people to start your plants in January or February or March, and that might not fit with what actually happens for you. So for me, if I were to start my tomatoes, even my peppers in January or February, yeah, absolutely. They would be huge by the time I actually get them in the ground in June. And so you have to take the advice for how it's intended, and it is good advice as to when to start different plants, but then you have to take that extra step. Is it good advice for you? Do your conditions match the conditions that the gardener that's giving you that advice has? And when you plant too early, exactly as this comment says, you can actually create a lot of problems. I've done that before when I was at the Galileo Garden 10 years ago, growing thousands of plants for the plant sale. And I had to start some plants earlier than I wanted to. And there was one year in particular, We had the plant sale in May, and the day we were going to do the plant sale, we had snow and wind. So we had to postpone our plant sale just a week. Well, because I had started so many of those plants, particularly the tomatoes, early, and now we're postponed by just a week. By the time we got to the point where we were selling plants, they were bulky. They were too big to be manageable in a garden in many cases. And so be careful about that. You really do need to look at your own individual conditions, because it might be bad advice to start early. Just because your favorite YouTuber on another channel is telling you to start your seeds or to get your transplants going, it may not be good advice. For you, it's bad advice. It's a great example. Absolutely wonderful to be talking about that aspect of it. It's not just eggshells and banana peels and all those kind of things that you hear the tips about. Often it is a good method, a good practice, but if it doesn't match you, it now becomes bad advice. Dusty Flat says, why such a fungus problem with homemade seed starting mix? I roast the peat. Yes, there's moisture, but I'm starting seeds. What's up? And so the peat that you're using is probably going to have spores in it, fungal spores. And unless you really heat it up for a sustained period of time, those spores can survive. And so that's probably what's going to create the fungus. I wouldn't worry too much about it. I don't worry about it at all. I just use the peat moss in my mixes, and I focus more on the watering. If you overwater your soil mix, then you're promoting the growth of the fungi. And if you keep the surface of the soil wet, then you're further increasing the likelihood that you'll have fungal problems. And so a fan can be great for this. Increasing air circulation can help reduce some of those fungal problems. And avoiding the tendency that we all have to overwater can reduce some of those fungal problems. And so that's the approach I take, and it works quite well for me, is just recognizing that a fungus needs a nice, moist environment to grow. And so if you're having a problem with damping off disease is actually different diseases caused by different types of fungus, but it all is kind of wrapped up into the same term. Allowing the surface of your potting soil to dry out in between waterings can greatly reduce those kind of fungal problems. As long as the root zone is moist, then everything's going to be fine. The whole pot, the whole container, it doesn't all need to be wet, just where the roots are. And that might be something that can help you as you move forward. I'm Just Stardust says, when I started my organic garden the first year, my brother visited me and gave me a bottle of insecticides and herbicides. He told me my garden was guaranteed a failure without those bottles. Absolutely. And this used to be good advice. And obviously, your brother still thinks of it as good advice. This is one of those things that for many decades, usually starting in about the 1950s. In the 1950s, after all the advances in the science of chemicals during World War II, you saw a really big increase in the use of pesticides and herbicides. And they found their way into the home garden, and it became the standard way of doing things. If you got a pest problem, use a pesticide. If you got a weed problem, use an herbicide. Without what we've learned since, a focus on the soil, a focus on diversity within the garden, a focus on integrated pest management and bringing in nature to help you out. And so what used to be good advice has turned into bad advice for those of us who don't see it as necessary. Now, there are many gardeners that still continue to garden with chemicals. And so if you're using a lot of chemical fertilizers and your soil hasn't reached that point where it can be healthy to sustain your plants, then you have become reliant on fertilizers. And for your plants to grow, you must keep using fertilizers until you make that switch to developing a good soil. It's the same with the ecosystem we have. If you are not encouraging the beneficial pests and animals, or beneficial insects and animals into your garden to deal with the pests, if you're doing everything you can to keep birds away from your garden, if you kill every single bug you see, then you're going to have a bad bug problem. And the solution is going to be pesticides. That's just about the only thing you can do, because the good bugs aren't there. Those beneficial predators aren't there to eat the bad bugs. So you have a reliance on chemicals. So you can see how we choose to garden makes a big difference in what's good advice and what's bad advice. If that's how you garden with chemicals, then yes, you've got to have those bottles to have success. But like me, and I know many of you, if you take a more organic approach, if you make an attempt to work with nature, suddenly you realize that you don't have any pest problem. You really don't have a concern about the soil life and a need for fertilizer, because you're a good gardener and you're doing good things in your garden, and you're allowing the garden to take care of itself. So recognize that. And I completely agree that the advice from a lot of gardeners, particularly the old gardeners, it often should be looked at as questionable. Even my advice, when I give suggestions, and I've made videos about this where I say, don't just trust me. Just because I say something, use that as your starting point. Use that as that foundational piece of information. But then look into it further to see, does it match you in your garden with the way you garden? And I've had the discourse back and forth with comments from gardeners who say they tried doing it my way, and it's because they don't have the patience. They've been growing with chemicals. They have a dead soil. I'm talking about amending and all the benefits. And so they give it 1 year, they amend their soil, and then they complain that their plants didn't do well and they had pests in the garden. Recognize that some of the advice, like that I tend to give, is long-term. It's modifying the way you garden so that you don't have those quick fix chemicals. Do what you prefer. Quick fix chemicals can work. That's why so many of them are sold and why so many gardeners choose to use them. So what's good advice for another may be bad advice for you, and vice versa. Our hen house 3 says, I was from the myth to use ground eggshells. Now I just put them in compost and water the plants regularly. Yeah, and that's actually what I do. I know that it's going to take a long time for the eggshells to break down. I crush my eggshells and I put them into the compost, not to provide calcium for my tomatoes, but to actually help add a little bit of structure to my soil when that compost finally makes it into the bed, and to benefit earthworms for my vermicomposting, for my red wigglers. I do the same thing. I crush the eggshells because they need the grit. You might not know this, but birds like chickens and turkeys have a gizzard, and the gizzard acts to grind up their food and release the nutrients. Earthworms have a gizzard. And so while the earthworms are going through the soil and using those small particles of sand that is going through their gut, it's helping out their gizzard. Well, if I can add a little bit of crushed eggshell to what my earthworms are going to eat, they can actually use some of the calcium that's within the eggshell and some of those other nutrients in the mix that I give them. So there's nothing wrong at all with adding eggshells into your garden. Just recognize that the purpose you're doing it makes a difference as to whether it is attributable to the good advice or the bad advice. So yeah, I agree with you that adding the eggshells to improve your soil and to cure blossom end rot is a myth, but there's nothing wrong with just adding the eggshells to your garden. Eventually, they will break down and they're more likely to be beneficial for the other microbes and organisms in your soil than they are for your plants directly. And that's a key differentiation. And so I'm not here to tell you not to do something, because if it gets you out in your garden and being out in your garden is beneficial for all of your plants as a whole, then keep doing it. And I'll continue to make videos, and a lot of others will continue to make videos about these myths and why they don't work for the purpose that they're attributed to. But it doesn't mean you can't do it or keep doing it. It's an option. June Ramirez says, question, using peroxide in water to kill fungus gnats in indoor plants. Do you have a suggestion on how and if to use it? So as I already said, I don't use hydrogen peroxide. Hydrogen peroxide is an option to kill some of the things that might be in your potting mix. But I take the approach of just being a good gardener and trying to water effectively, increasing my air circulation. I use a sterile mix to start with, so the likelihood of having some type of disease in my mix is very, very low. And so I don't have those problems because it becomes a maintenance issue. How am I maintaining my plants? If you have a concern, if you're reusing your potting mix and you think there might be something in that mix, then yeah, you can use hydrogen peroxide and you can bake it in the oven, and that will help sterilize the mix. There's nothing wrong with that. I just haven't seen the advice, even though yes, hydrogen peroxide is effective at killing some things in the soil. Hydrogen peroxide does not kill the fungus gnats. What is killing the fungus gnats is the hydrogen peroxide and some of those other methods that might be killing the eggs of the fungus gnats. So if you had fungus gnats and you reuse that potting mix, there's probably eggs, fungus gnat eggs that are in that mix. That's what you're doing. You're not killing the gnats, you're just killing the eggs. And by allowing the surface to dry out, now you are taking away the food source for the fungus gnats, and they'll go someplace else or they'll die. And so that's how I use it, is I don't. But if I had that problem, I would only be looking at doing it for the potting mix, but then continuing to water effectively so that the fungus gnats can't find a home. And even if there are some eggs and those eggs hatch, if the soil surface is dry, now the fungus doesn't grow and the gnats have nothing to feed on. And that's kind of how the life cycle of fungus gnats work. So if you can break their life cycle, you don't need to rely on hydrogen peroxide or any of those other methods. Cinnamon is another great example of what could be bad advice. Cinnamon has antifungal properties to it. So you may have seen this, that if you have a problem with fungus gnats, that you sprinkle cinnamon on the surface of your potting mixes when the seedlings start appearing. And that's because the cinnamon will tend to deter some of that fungal growth. And without that fungal growth, now the fungus gnats go away. So it's not that the cinnamon is killing the fungus gnats necessarily. It's just changing the environment that is suitable for the fungus gnats. If you don't have a fungus gnat problem, or if you don't have a fungal problem at all, adding cinnamon really doesn't do anything for your seedling growth. And cinnamon can be expensive if you buy it in those little jars at the supermarket. And so this is where I think it becomes bad advice, because if you're spending money to do something and there's no need for you to do that, or the reason you're doing it really isn't going to solve the problem you have, then it's a waste of money. And anything that wastes money in the garden, to me, I think is something that should be looked into a little bit further and may fall into that category of bad advice. So we'll see what else is popping up here. Yeah, there you go. I'm still catching up with the comments. So Gina says, have you tried an oscillating fan on your seedlings to stop gnats? Works great for me. There you go. Yep, substantiation. The method works. And I've got a video on using a fan for your seedlings. Not only does it make a difference with whether you have a fungal issue or not, but it can make your seedlings stronger. And there are studies that show this, that the oscillation of the air will actually, it's like the wind blowing outside. A tree, a plant that is exposed to wind is going to have a stronger trunk or stalk than the same plant that would be growing in still air. And so, yeah, fans definitely makes a difference to what you're going to do in the seed starting stage or within your garden. Okay, let's see. I'm seeing some stuff. So I saw that Daniel Ha was asking questions about some photos and wanting to know about the background. So this is my garden background right now, and it's from a couple years ago actually. Just because I went out this morning to take a current picture and it's just too windy and everything's blown away and my garden still looks the same as it did a few weeks ago when I showed my garden in the background. So I'm trying to get into the spring spirit with the flowers and the plants growing in my garden. But if you have a background that you want to send to me so that I can show in the background, send it to gardenerscott@gardenerscott.com and put it in landscape mode. Give me permission to use it. I've gotten some photos in the last month or two from people sharing their gardens, and I love when you share your photos with me. But unless you specifically say that I can use your photo in the live stream, I'm not going to use it. I don't want to violate any copyright concerns that you or others might have. And so give me a good quality photo in landscape. Give me a little background. Tell me what it is, where you are, what you're doing. And then with the permission, I'll be trying to load in more backgrounds as we move forward into the summer. I think I've mostly used up all the winter pictures that I was given, and the ones that I haven't used didn't have all those permissions, or the photo wasn't able to actually transfer because it was a vertical as opposed to a horizontal. So recognize those limitations, and I'm glad to look at your pictures in the background, just like I know others are glad to see it. So bonjour, Thio Bilou from France. Nice to see you here today. It's so nice to see people checking in from literally all over the world. I just love this relationship we all have and this community that we all have. It's really a fantastic opportunity. Christine Stress Reliever says, I'm planning on listening to some Irish music today while planting some cabbage and carrot seeds. Any Clancy Brothers or Irish Rover fans doing the same today? So I'm not doing the same today because, as I mentioned earlier, I am not doing the plants. It's still too early for me, and I've already started some seeds, and so it's a little bit early for some of the other seeds. But absolutely, I have the Irish Rover channel that I play in my earbuds when I'm out in the garden. So when it's a nice day and I'm going to be out, I'm going to be working and digging and building, I like listening to the Irish Rovers, absolutely. So for me, it's not just a St. Patrick's Day thing, though today is a good day to learn about Irish music if you are not a fan. I'm a huge fan of Irish music, and I love the Rovers. The new stuff, the old stuff, they go back a ways. So good idea to be doing something like that when you're working in the garden, to be listening. I change my music up depending on what task I'm doing, whether it's a quiet, calm task or an energetic task, and the Rovers definitely fit. We talked about that a couple weeks ago, I think, about some of our favorite music in the garden. So I think that's a good option if you like listening to music. And then podcasts as well. I've actually set up two different podcast channels here on the Gardener Scott channel on YouTube. YouTube now offers podcasts, and it's becoming the biggest platform for podcasts. And so if you're looking for something to do in the garden, you can check out the Gardener Scott podcast. I've got two of them. One, the conversations that I have with some of my guests, and then others, some of the topics that we cover that I think is good information that you could listen to while you're gardening. So That's kind of how I set up those podcasts. So music and podcasts, that's what I'm doing in the garden. And it really does help the time go by. Patrick, nice to see you. Hope you're not getting blown away today. Asking, best advice I've gotten was to keep records of the things I try to do in my garden. The value of a gardening journal cannot be overstated. Excellent point. And so, yeah, so when we talk about bad advice, absolutely, we should be talking about the good advice. So often we're focused on those tips and tricks and those quick fixes that we think that's going to be good. And I think another reason why that falls into the bad advice category is because it's better, in my opinion, to have a garden journal, to try things, to keep track of what's working, to keep track of your weather, the varieties you're planting, how you are gardening. Then, when things work, you can actually refer to your garden journal and recognize that your tomatoes were doing just fine before you added eggshells to the soil. And all of a sudden, when you missed a couple days of watering and the soil really dried out, or maybe you had a really hot spell, or it was really windy, and then a couple weeks later, you noticed that the fruit on your tomato plants had blossom end rot. That's how you develop the experience and the knowledge base to recognize what's good advice and what's bad advice, because you're tracking your own garden and how you garden. And that allows you to recognize what's working for you in your garden. So, absolutely, Pat, the value of a garden journal cannot be overstated. If you are not keeping track of what you're doing, do it. And of course, I've got I got a couple of videos on garden journals, of course, but I started and I still just keep track of things in a binder. I just pieces of paper, just a ringed binder, and I'll make notes. I have, and I continue to use the fancy garden journals that you buy, and it has everything broken out. And in my new book, actually, I've got a 2-page section where I give you suggestions on how you can start a garden journal, and I give you those pages that you can actually use to keep track of some of this information. That's how I've been doing it for years, and it's enabled me to recognize the real causal relationships, what is really happening in my garden. And if it's something I'm doing, or if it's a particular variety, or if it's the weather, and then seeing what the result is. And sometimes it's good and sometimes it's bad. And when you keep track of those kind of things and keep those journals and refer back to them periodically, I show that in the one video I made where I look at a garden journal that I had done years before. And you forget what you were keeping track of in those years before. So not only keep a journal, but try to figure out a method so that you refer to some of that information in the years past so that you can make those comparisons as each year progresses. So absolutely wonderful, wonderful idea. But is saying this may sound crazy, but the advice of seed packets can be bad. You're right. In my climate, the last frost date is a bad guide because our soil stays cool for weeks after that date. Yeah, this gets back, and I'll say it again. I've said it a few times in recent weeks. Too much focus is given to your hardiness zone and when to start your plants. Hardiness zone and when to start your plants have no connection at all. And I continue to have people asking me questions about their squash, their pumpkins, their tomatoes. They'll say, I'm in zone 6 and my tomatoes, those should never be really in the same sentence, because the zone you're in has no bearing on what you're going to grow in your garden, when to put those plants into your garden. The hardiness zone is purely the coldest day you have on average. And so it's a 1-day thing every year, but we put so much focus on what our hardiness zone is. And this can be a big problem when it comes to the seed packets, because you'll have a seed packet that is sold nationally, sometimes internationally, and it gives you this basic advice. And often that advice comes from the growers at that seed company. Well, the seed company might be in zone 7. And so they're telling you when to start based on their zone 7. Or there's a huge seed company. You've seen their seed packets. There's actually a map of the United States, and it's got all the different zones and tells you when to start their plants based on this thick band that runs across the United States. I can't do that. Here in Colorado, at 7,000 feet elevation, I cannot start my seeds at the time that a lot of these seed companies are telling me to start the seeds. Now, when the packet says to plant based on your last frost date, that now becomes good advice because all of our last frost date is different. And it really can be focused on our own individual planting time. But when there are those generalities on the seed packets, you're exactly right, Bud. It becomes bad advice for some. Again, within those bands, when they give advice of when to plant, there's going to be thousands of gardeners that follow that advice, and everything is going to be okay. But then there's a whole bunch of us that are going to follow that advice, and it's not going to work. It's bad advice for us, even when it's a big seed company that's telling us what we should be doing. Hello to Norma Cohn, Manitoba, Canada. Nice to see you here. I always like to shout out my Canadian friends. So nice that you're here today. I've driven through Manitoba many, many years ago. One of my enjoyable drives through Canada. So nice to see you here. Christine Stress Reliever is wondering, what are your thoughts of growing zucchini in a 10-gallon grow bag? In a grow bag, I can move it to follow the sun. Yeah, absolutely. And so I've grown zucchini. And so zucchini, I think, tends to be better in a grow bag than some other squashes. And so when I grow like a yellow squash, and like this last year where I grew a squash, the Tahitian melon squash, those squashes can get very long vines. And growing those type of squashes in a grow bag can be done, absolutely. A 10-gallon bag, sure, plenty of soil for it. But you can't move those bags as readily once the vines start growing. But a zucchini tends to stay more erect and more compact. It doesn't vine and send out a bigger plant that will go outside the edges of that 10-gallon grow bag. And yeah, you can move it, absolutely. So I say do it. And I would encourage you, this, and this gets back to the good advice and the bad advice. So I am saying, yes, I encourage that you try it, grow some zucchini in a grow bag. But I would also encourage that you, in this same year, grow zucchini in a in-ground bed, in a raised bed, in some other form. And now compare the two and see which does better. So for instance, potatoes. I've got videos on how to grow potatoes in grow bags. And my good buddy, Tony O'Neill, grows potatoes in his containers. And we both have great success growing potatoes. But I have more success growing my potatoes in my raised beds. And Tony and others will tell you similar stories. When you grow your potatoes in the ground or in a raised bed, they tend to do better. They tend to give you bigger tubers. You might get a bigger harvest. But if you don't have the space, or if you're growing dozens of containers like Tony does, then you don't have the raised bed to put that many potatoes in. It makes sense to use a grow bag or some other container. And that's how I approach my potatoes. Even though I know they're going to do better in my raised beds because I have done that comparative planting, I want to use my raised beds for peppers and tomatoes and squash, those plants that end up getting so big that the grow bag really isn't best for them. Potatoes can really do well in a grow bag. So there's my thoughts. I say do it and try to have a comparative analysis, even if it's what happened last year when you weren't using a grow bag. And this gets us back to the Garden Journal, keeping track of what you're doing and how it compares can really make a big difference when you're trying to decide which is a better way of doing. Serena is asking, how much eggshell powder should go in the compost bin, and when should I stop adding so I can use the compost? So I'm not saying you should add the eggs or the ground eggshells to the compost. I'm not saying that. So when you're asking how much should go in the compost bin, I don't have an answer for that, because I don't necessarily think it should go into the compost. If you choose to put it into the compost, put in whatever you want. It's not going to hurt anything. And because it takes so long to break down, it's going to take a long time for you to see the benefits of it. So it's how often are you using eggs? That's kind of how I approach the eggs I add to my compost pile. So when you're building a pile, depending on how much you have in the way of the organic materials, the greens and the browns, when you build your pile, at some point, you have to stop building your pile. You have enough volume, and you just have to wait for it to decompose. So how many eggs are you using during that time? I don't eat a lot of eggs. So when I'm crushing my eggshells and I add them to the compost pile, it might be 8 eggs, it might be 12 eggs, it might be 3 eggs. It all depends on how many eggs that I have had during that building process, and if I even decided to save the eggshells. So it's not what you should do when we talk about some of these options. This is an alternative. If you have eggshells and you think they should be in your garden, then adding them through the compost is one way that you can do it. And I know there have been no studies that talk about adding eggshells to compost. So whatever I say to do is just my opinion, and what you choose to do is something that I think you should try, and then make note of it and see if it makes any difference at all. I just like to reuse as much as I can. And so the idea of throwing eggshells away when I can feed them to my worms is one of those options that I take. So whatever you've got, Serena, just add them to your compost, and I doubt it's going to be too much. But think about building the compost pile and not continuing to add it. And I've done this. I continue to do this. When you're making compost and you just keep adding to the compost pile, and you keep adding to the compost pile, and you keep adding to the compost pile, you're not going to get that growth of the beneficial microbes that are really going to break it down quickly and give you the compost. Every time you add new material to an established compost pile, you're slowing down the process. And so build it and then move on to a new pile, or whatever your options are going to be for the materials you happen to use. And so, for instance, one of the options that you might see, and this falls into the bad advice category, is to dig a trench and then put in your orange peels and your banana peels and the broccoli stalks and whatever you've got. Bury them in this trench in your garden bed, and you're going to have wonderful soil as a result of it. Well, there's some validity to this. Whenever we add organic matter to our soil, the soil microbes are going to break down that material. It's going to decompose, and during the decomposition, it is going to release nutrients into the soil that other insects and microbes can use, that will then make it move throughout the garden bed. And at some point, the nutrient is going to be the type of nutrient that the plant needs. When you put a trench of broccoli and bananas and pomegranates and whatever else you've got in your garden, that is not benefiting your plants. And anyone who says that burying those things in your garden will make your plants grow better, with the understanding that it's going to happen this year, it's bad advice. It doesn't work that quickly. And that's not how it works. And in fact, and you may see comments about this, I get comments and questions about this on a regular basis, the plants do worse. Well, the reason for that is getting back to the roots of the science. That decomposition process that all those microbes are undertaking requires nitrogen. And a lot of that nitrogen comes from the ingredients that you buried. But there's also nitrogen in our garden soil. So as those microbes are decomposing all that material, they're not just eating all of that stuff you buried. There's an explosion of microbes because there's new food. You know, the smorgasbord is open. It's time to go in and have a big lunch. So you have this explosion of microbes. They're going to start using the nitrogen that's in the soil to help with that population. What's going to happen? Our plants no longer have the nitrogen that they need because all that stuff you buried robbed it. We talked about nitrogen depletion. That's one of the things that causes nitrogen depletion. When we put something in the soil that robs the nitrogen from the plants, and then your plants suffer. So dig a trench, bury the things in the trench, give it some time, because it's probably going to be about at least a year before those nutrients are released back into the soil. And don't plant on top of it. Just take a section of your bed. I'm not a big fan of trench composting or bucket composting. You'll see this as well, where you bury a bucket in the middle of your garden bed, fill it with all the scraps, allow it to decompose, and it's going to release nutrients into your garden. Yes, it will in time. But think about how much space you're losing because you now got a big bucket in the middle of your raised bed, or you've got this trench that you really shouldn't be planting on top of because of the potential nitrogen depletion. So having a compost pile is pretty much the best way to take those ingredients and break them down quicker so you can put them back into your soil sooner rather than letting nature take its course, because nature can take a long time. And that's one of those things that the longer it takes, the less effective it is. And the less effective it is, now we start moving into that bad advice category. So start thinking about those kind of things. Time is an important consideration in gardening. And I had asked this question a year or so ago on a live stream, I think it was, when I was talking about one of the most important factors for plants. And of course, sun and light and water, all those things are extremely important. But from a gardener's perspective, I think time should be ranked in the top 5 as well, because we have to put our plants into the garden at the right time. We have to do all the appropriate maintenance for our plants at the right time. And the soil needs to be prepared at the right time. And so some of the advice, a lot of the advice that's focused on our garden soil and how to improve it doesn't take that into account. You can't get an immediate reaction from anything that you bury in your soil. It takes time for the soil life to do its magic and make everything available for the plants. Jay Dixon is reminding people, and thank you for this, Jay. So as I'm scrolling through all of these hundreds of comments, what I'm looking for is exactly this. If you want a question answered, go ahead and put the @GardnerScott, like Jay is suggesting. If you have the @GardnerScott, I am much more likely to see your question. If you just say question, if you put it in all caps, I may scroll right through it. I'm looking for a question that has the @GardnerScott in it, and I'm much more likely to look for something like that. Now, as I'm scrolling through, if I don't see those, then it's one of those things that I'm going to start reverting to other things, like this one from Sunflower Girl saying, hello, Gardener Scott. When seedlings, if it calls for stratification, I think that's what it's called, and any formula to loam soil or video, 2 questions. And so, yes, stratification. So when we talk about seed stratification, there are some seeds that require exposure to cold conditions, and they need that cold to germinate. You can still start those seeds without the stratification, but the germination percentage is usually relatively low. So to get greater germination, you want to make sure you put those seeds in a refrigerator for a month or 2 months. Often, if the seed calls for stratification, it'll give you an idea of how long they need to be stratified. And then as far as the formula to loam soil, I'm not sure what you're asking about for that. So I will continue to scroll. And if I see your question pop up with an @Gardener Scott, I'm more likely to see it. So here you go. Thank you, Nathan. This is exactly it. @Gardener Scott, how are your Espalier apple trees doing? I've not seen anything on it in a while. And so my Espalier apple tree is doing great. The problem I had when I made a video about the Espalier apple tree, I think 3 years ago, I had it set up against my house. I made a video that showed how to do it, did the initial pruning on it. And then my wonderful garden dog Mala, I love Mala. Mala loves sticks. And Mala was still relatively young. And every night, still, she brings sticks into the house because she just likes chewing on sticks. Well, she discovered that this tree right there on the wall, on the path that goes into the house, was at the right height for her to have a good, fresh, sweet tasting stick. And she ate my tree. She literally ripped the branches off of my Espalier apple tree. So since then, and the reason you haven't seen a video is I had to take that tree out because it was eaten down to a nub by Mala. I had to get a new apple tree and plant it in the same space. Then I had to put a fence around it so Mala couldn't get in. Then I had to go through 2 years of pruning to now get to the point that I can do a video about the Espalier and give an update. The last year, when I did the video on what didn't work in my garden, and I talked about the oregano taking over that spot, you can actually see the recovery of the Espalier right behind it. If you want to see an update, look for that video from last year about what went wrong in my garden. It was focused on the oregano, but you can see the Espalier tree and where it's at now. And so I'm planning this year to have a video that shows how I've trained it and how I'm getting it into its final shape. And maybe even this year, it's doing so great, I might get fruit after 3 years. 3 years for the first time you get fruit is kind of on the early end, but it can happen. So thank you for asking that. Yeah, look for that video to come. And I'm planting a new garden area, new garden that is going to be fenced in, and I'll be putting some Espalier trees in that. So you'll be able to see how I choose some of my Espalier shapes moving into the future as well. So I'm going to have some fun with that project. I've talked about it here and there. I know I'm teasing a lot of you with the ideas of this new garden, but it's coming, and it's going to include a lot of the things I've been doing, but now it becomes a showcase location for a lot of those things I've been doing. And so Gina's asking if we can find a YouTube gardener with similar climate or just nearby, the garden timing advice will be a lot closer. Absolutely. And I think this is a great opportunity. If you can find a gardener that you trust on YouTube in particular that has a similar climate and they suggest when they're starting seeds, then that can be good information to follow. That being said, you still need to take it all with a grain of salt and do your own research. One of the reasons I wanted to do this video today is because on Facebook, I'm part of a local gardener group. It's not my group. I'm just kind of there in the background. Occasionally, I'll answer questions. And the question came up about 3 weeks ago, the middle of February. Someone saying, I'm new to Colorado Springs. When should I start my tomatoes? A ton of people jumped in saying, I'm starting my tomatoes right now. Well, I'm sorry. Our last frost date is the middle of May. So if you're starting in the middle of February, you've got March and April and May, 12 weeks for those tomato plants to be growing. The conditions are not going to be right because we often have that snow in the middle of May. You add another 2 weeks or so to when the plant should go in the ground, and the tomato plants are going to be too tall. They're going to be stressed at transplanting. And if you do put them in the ground too early, now they're going to be stunted because of the temperature within the soil and the temperature of the weather we typically get at that time of year. And so that's bad advice. It may work for some people in some areas near where I live that might be part of that Facebook page, but it's not good advice for everybody that's reading that Facebook page, even though we're all living in the same city. So be wary, even with the expert gardeners in your area. Use that as a foundational start and then learn from there. Follow the advice and see how it works for you. And then modify it as you proceed over the course of your gardening journey. And before you know it, you're in a position that you can be recommending to others when to start seeds in your area. So I do that in my garden club all the time because the new gardeners in my garden club will ask a question like that. Anytime someone says, I heard or I saw on YouTube, I become wary right away because a lot of that advice comes from somebody outside the local area. And so if somebody heard on YouTube when to start a plant, unless it came from me, it wasn't a gardener in this part of Colorado. And they saw on YouTube, well, unless it was me, it wasn't this part of the country. So, I say that to my gardener friends is just because somebody in New Jersey or San Diego is telling you what to do in your garden, it doesn't necessarily work for us here in Colorado. And that holds true with all of you, regardless of where you happen to be. So bad gardening advice is for you to figure out what is bad for you. I can give you guidance and tips, and I can point out some things that just scientifically doesn't make sense. But there's some good advice out there. You just got to weed through it to figure out which is the good advice that works for you and which is the advice that is going to end up being bad for you. And I know because I've said this so many times, I've killed so many plants. I've killed thousands and thousands of plants. And a lot of those plants were killed because I followed somebody else's advice that didn't match what I should be doing. But I learned. Every failure is an opportunity for future success. So don't worry that if you do something wrong, that it's going to be a bad thing. Go ahead and do it and then learn from it. Whether it works or doesn't work, go ahead and do it because you may find that you've learned a lot just from that effort. Gregory Kissel's asking, tell about the panel hoops in your background photo. Yeah, these are my favorite hoops that I have throughout my garden, and I talk about them from time to time. And so I talk about them in my book, of course, and I've made videos about how to make the cattle panel hoops, and that's what they are. They're hoops made from cattle panels. So a cattle panel comes 16 feet long and 50 inches high. It's intended for ranchers, and they make hog panels that are similar but slightly different shape, size, hole. They make sheep panels, same basic idea. So depending where you are and what your primary ranching industry might be nearby, you might have access to different panels. But all of them are very sturdy galvanized steel. And so the panels I use are 4-gauge steel, very strong, very sturdy. And I cut the panels to a length that gives me a nice hoop that I can put over my garden. And so a 16-foot long cattle panel, I can cut into 2 panels that are 8 feet long. And then I bend those to make a hoop. And those hoops tend to be about 3 feet tall. I can cut off 4 feet of that 16-foot panel and then cut it in half. So now I'm left with a 6-foot long piece of the cattle panel, bend it into shape to fit my beds, and it's about 2.5 feet tall. And so that's what you see here. I like to do that size. They're panels that were cut down to 6 feet. And then as I show in the video, I have a video where I make a tomato trellis using a cattle panel, and I show how I cut that and how I bend it. It's effort. I mean, it's strong steel, so you have to put your whole body into it to bend it into shape. And once it's bent into shape, it stays in that shape. And then when you put it in your bed, it stays in the bed. It's too heavy to blow away. It's not going to move. I will cut those pieces of panel to give me a little bit of a prong on one end, and then I'll stick that prong end into the soil just to stabilize it when I'm working around the bed and covering it with the sheets of plastic or the shade cloth or the hail cloth or the insect cover, whatever I'm putting over my beds. But I just put the hoops in place like you see in this picture, and I leave them in place throughout the year. And they're pre-sized to the bed, and it works great. So I'm a huge fan of the panel hoops that I use in the background, and I strongly advocate the use of the cattle panel hoops. And so this is one of those tips where if you have access to cattle panels and you want to put the effort in it and you want to make hoops from those cattle panels, you will probably find that they work great for you. But if there's another way you like to do it, then keep doing it the way you like to do it. I just like the portability because I don't always grow the same things every year. I'll often grow peppers in the same raised beds. Sometimes I'll do garlic in the same raised bed. Sometimes I'll do squash in the same raised beds from season to season. But I also like to mix it up a little bit when I'm trying new plants and I'm doing different experiments. And so I can move these hoops around. I just lift them up. I mean, they're heavy. I'll lift them up and just move them to a new bed depending on what I'm growing in that bed. So yeah, I love my cattle panel hoops. And this is one of those things that really, really, I think can make a difference. Bud saying this may sound crazy, but the advice of seed packets can be, I think I already covered this. I think I was going backwards instead of going forwards. So let's go ahead and try to catch up with real time a little bit. Big Will Dog says, today's agenda is starting to harden off my onions, celery, cilantro, and celery. Then I'm getting most of my carrots started, but kept in the garage till they sprout. Good for you. I like that idea. And that's how I like to approach gardening as well, is you set an agenda for the day. I'll set an agenda for the whole season, of course. When you watch my planning videos, you understand more about that. But I have an overall season plan. I have a monthly plan. I have a weekly plan. And I have a daily plan. And within the daily plan, I'll break it down to whether it's in the morning or the afternoon. So yeah, I love setting an agenda for what you're going to do in the garden and trying to stick with it as much as possible. Sometimes the weather doesn't cooperate with what you had hoped to do, but definitely start with an agenda. Shanty's Garden says, but Charles Dowding says a lot of intercropping so he can go a little bit more dense with his planting. He picks them at the peak of freshness and sweetness and take them to garden. Oh yeah, I'm a huge fan of intercropping. In my book, I talk about intercropping, and I actually have diagrams and break down the math to be able to get the maximum number of plants within a space, where you start with a plant that takes a bigger amount of space, and then you fit in other plants that are smaller, and then you can fit in even other plants that are smaller than that. And intercropping is one of the biggest advantages to raised bed gardening, because you can plan the intercropping and put in all of those plants. So yeah, absolutely. And then it ties in very well, and this might be what you're talking about, is it ties in very well with succession planting. So if you choose the plants and harvest them at varying times over the season, you can continue to put plants into that bed and get even more harvest. So, oh yeah, I'm a huge fan of intercropping, and intensive planting is what I call it in the book, where you are really trying to get the most out of every square inch of your garden bed. So definitely do that. And you should find some of that success that if you're just planting a few plants and you're wondering how you could grow more, start putting more plants in, and you'll realize that you really can grow a lot more. Shandy's Garden says, thinning out. I'm using very small cells in coco coir, a little anxious about potting up. Instead of disturbing the very densely seeded clump, can I cut off the stems at the surface? Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And this is one of those things, when we thin out our plants, it's often easier to pull the plant that you want that doesn't need to be there anymore. And so you thin out by pulling or pricking out the plants. You can cut it, absolutely. And no surprise, I show this in my book as well, where I have very small pruners, like little scissors. And especially for plants like carrots, for instance, if you pull a carrot plant, a little seedling, it actually releases the chemicals into the air. And those chemicals can be picked up by things like a carrot maggot fly, and they'll come down to your carrot patch and lay eggs. Well, if you cut off the plant at the surface, indoors or outdoors, you release, or you do not release those chemicals. You kind of prevent the release of those chemicals because you're just cutting the stem. Now, different chemicals are being released into the air, and anytime you cut a stem or you prune a plant, there are going to be insects that go, oh, we've got a weak plant down there. I can smell the weak plant. Well, it's the cut plant that may attract some insect pests. So be aware of that. That's kind of the trade-off. Some pulling will attract some insect pests, and some cutting will attract insect pests. But you can do either one. And a lot of it depends on the plant. So like with a carrot, if you pull the plants right next to it, you might disrupt the roots of the carrots that remain. And those carrots might not grow straight because their roots were disrupted when you pulled out another one. So I always cut off my carrots for both of those reasons. I don't have a pest problem, but I don't want to start a pest problem. There are others that you won't have that issue. And so like tomatoes, for instance, and peppers, they're so hardy. Their roots are so strong. You can pull out the plant, you can separate out that clump and then individually plant those plants and they'll do fine. So yeah, don't be afraid. Just go ahead and do it. And it gets back to that whole experimentation thing. Just do it. And you'll see that it's probably not going to be an issue. It's one of those opportunities. So like for me with carrots, I can get in and just go snip, 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 and the carrots are thinned out. With my tomatoes, because I take that time to pull them apart, and I usually repot, now thinning out actually becomes a major endeavor because I put more into it. Those are kind of the trade-offs when you choose one over the other. If I'm just thinning out, like if I've got tomatoes that fall to the ground in my beds and then sprout the next year, yeah, I just pull those out and then just toss them on the surface without thinking about it. And then when I'm growing tomatoes indoors before they go outside, and I've got too many tomato plants and it's not worth my time and effort to repot them after separating, yeah, I'll just separate them out and I'll just toss them into the pile that ends up in the compost. So you can try lots of different options, and I suggest you just go ahead and do it. Sherry says, my San Marzano tomatoes from last year want to know if I should persist or give it up and go to black Krim. And so totally different types of tomatoes. San Marzano is the paste tomato. And so if you're growing the tomatoes for the purpose of making sauce or paste, then yeah, absolutely go with the San Marzano. But if you're growing the tomatoes for the taste and for how well they grow, then you might do black Krim. And I'm guessing that's why you're asking this question. The San Marzano, while a delicious paste tomato, they don't taste the same in a salad as a black Krim, and they don't taste as fresh when you eat them straight. So I would say ask yourself those kind of questions. What are you trying to get from your tomatoes? And you might be able to grow both if you've got the space. I'm going back to black Krim this year. This year I'm growing with the seeds I already have, and I've got my black Krim seeds. I'm definitely growing black Krim. I'm not sure if I'm going to do San Marzano and all the other paste tomatoes that I did a couple years ago, because I ended up not making the sauce and the paste like I thought I would. And so because I made some, but not as much as I had anticipated, I don't know if I'm going to do that this year. So personally, I'm going with black creme over San Marzano just because of how I use the tomatoes. And I like my tomatoes fresh. And there are a few things that are better than the black creme. I don't know how many of those I've discovered yet. Black creme is pretty high on the list, but I'm going to keep looking for something that might be better. I love my black cremes, so we'll see. Eva Nichols Art says, I agree wholeheartedly that it's so annoying that even some of the gardening apps use the hardiness zone as a base for recommending when to start annual flowers and veggies. Yeah. And you know, as long as it's just an annoyance and you recognize the difference, that's the way I treat it as well. And I still, take the advice, and I still, I'm willing to see what the apps and the seed packets say. But that's one reason why I like the Planter app. So I helped develop. I didn't develop the actual app, but they've taken a lot of my input for the Planter app that I have in the description below, and they base all their recommendations on your last frost date. So instead of just giving a blanket plant this at this time, like a lot of planting apps do, the Planter app allows you to enter in your last frost date. And so now the app is actually focused on your environment and your garden. And then when it gives the recommendations of when to start seeds, it's because you've already helped it out by providing some of that information. That's the way I like to use the apps, is those that allow that interface and allow you to actually participate in the app so you can get the best information. Okay. So it's so nice to see all of this great information that's being shared, and all your great questions, of course. And so I appreciate you all so much. I know I can't get to everything. And so it's good that you're here. It's good that you're helping each other out. And it's good that Heidi is here. We were wondering about you, Heidi. So I was hoping that all was going well with you. And I'm glad you're home now, and hope the doctor appointment went well. So thank you for being here and participating in this as well, Heidi. So I do appreciate you, of course, and love having you here at every opportunity. So Lily's asking, do you think pine shavings mixed with chicken manure robs nitrogen? So it depends on how you use it. And the chicken manure mixed with pine shavings is a great idea outside the garden bed. So the carbon of the pine shavings and the nitrogen of the fresh chicken manure are perfect matches for decomposition. The wood is going to start decomposing with that nitrogen, and the organic matter within the chicken manure is going to start decomposing because it's so high in nitrogen. And so together, that's a great beginning of a compost pile. You add in some other ingredients, and it's wonderful. I think that's the best way to use the chicken manure, is in the compost pile, because it's such a great nitrogen source. If you put the shavings and the chicken manure directly into your garden soil, then you're probably going to have some issues. Yes, the buried wood is going to rob some of the nitrogen, not throughout the bed, but just wherever that wood happens to be within the bed. And then there is the potential for some introduction of pathogens. You could be adding E. coli to your garden bed by adding fresh chicken manure. So both of those are great. The best way to avoid any nitrogen concerns is to do it in your compost pile, or in a separate pile that's not even really a compost pile, just a way to take wood chips or wood shavings, and essentially you're creating like a leaf mold pile, because throw in some dried leaves as well, and then add the chicken manure, and you can develop a really nice rich mix. When you look at the Back to Eden gardening method, Back to Eden is basically built around wood chips and growing your plants in the wood chips. What's often missed, and this to tie it back to the bad advice idea, if you think that the back to Eden gardening method is just the wood chips, and you put a bunch of wood chips in your garden and you try to grow in the wood chips, you're probably not going to have much success, because the other part of the back to Eden method is the chicken manure. It's adding that extra component to the wood chips to actually provide the nutrients and to help those wood chips decompose. So the pine shavings and the chicken manure as a mulch on a bed, and give it some time, just so those pathogens are no longer an issue and that the decomposition has started, then you could plant in that bed and kind of do a modified back to Eden gardening method. So how you want to use them and what you're trying to gain from those materials are really an important part of the question. And therefore, the answer really needs to be determined based on if you've got a lot of wood chips and you've got a lot of chicken manure, start a big compost pile and put those in it. And that would be, my opinion, the best way to go. Okay, James is asking, James M., good question. What are your thoughts on using sand or clay instead of water for a thermal battery for a greenhouse? My winters are longer and colder than yours, for reference. Okay, so when you look at thermodynamics, and when you look at how much energy, how much thermal energy that a substance can absorb, water is at the top of the list. And when you look at how quickly the material absorbs it, you're going to see that the sand and the clay are going to absorb it faster. When you look at how quickly that thermal energy in the form of heat is released, you're going to see that the sand and clay release it faster. So basically how it works, the water absorbs the energy, the heat, slowly. And then it releases that heat slowly. So I like water in my greenhouse because I can go out, and I've done this. I've got a video where I actually measure the temperatures at different times of day. If you haven't seen my greenhouse video that discusses the temperature variation, and I've got a few different greenhouse videos that discuss it. I've gone out and measured the temperature, and you can see it where the concrete, I have concrete blocks and I've got gravel and I've got sand and I've got water as thermal batteries within my greenhouse. The mineral-based components absorb heat very quickly. They get hot, but then they release it quickly. And so when I go out at midnight or 5 o'clock in the morning, they're cold. They are no longer providing any benefit to the air in my greenhouse to keep it warm. But the water is, even when it gets down frigid. So I've within the last couple years had minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 26 Celsius. That's cold. Was my greenhouse that cold? No. On those days with no other supplemental heating, my greenhouse was at 15 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 9 Celsius. So it was the water that really made that big a difference. Without the water, without that mass to keep the air temperature in my greenhouse from dropping lower, it would have been well below 0 Fahrenheit. So totally up to you, because the key difference, of course, is when you have that much water. I've got 250 gallons of water in my small greenhouse. It takes up a lot of space, which reduces the number of plants I want to grow. And so the water allows me to maintain a more moderate temperature. So essentially, the greenhouse is at zone 7 without any supplemental heat because of the water. If you add supplemental heat, and I've experimented with that this winter, by adding a heater, you can keep it warmer. And the water still helps, but the water isn't as necessary if you've got a heater. So sand or clay as a thermal battery will work, but you'll probably find, especially in a really cold environment, that you're going to need supplemental heating of some type. If you want to go fully unheated, like I do, then water really, from a physics perspective, is a better choice if you're trying to absorb and hold and then release the energy to a point that it can benefit the air and ultimately the plants that are in your garden. And I think that's really the biggest issue, is why you have that. I'm not actively growing in my greenhouse in the winter. And so I'm just trying to keep the Chicago fig trees that I have in my greenhouse alive by increasing the hardiness zone within my greenhouse. And so while my hardiness zone takes me down to that minus 15 Fahrenheit, by keeping it at the equivalent of a zone 7 at 15 degrees Fahrenheit, then those Chicago figs will survive. That's the reason that I'm doing it. So hopefully that helps answer the question, because it works. If you do the sand and the clay, I would suggest that you water them, even in the winter. Keep them moist, because a moist soil or a moist sand or a moist clay is going to retain more heat energy than a dry sand or a dry clay. And so water definitely ever gets into it. So Sherry, that's a great question. Okay, I might tip my hand here. Have I ever done a Belgian fence? But when I was talking about the fence and this new garden area that I'm talking about, I'm thinking about a Belgian fence. And that's all I'm going to say. That's a teaser, because the rest of you are saying, what's a Belgian fence? So that's coming. Yeah, that is one of those things that I did a small one with just, I think I had 3 trees at the Galileo garden, but I'm thinking about doing a much bigger one for my new garden area. So I hope I've piqued your interest, and I hope you all go on and do your own research, look up what a Belgian fence is, because I think it's going to be fun if I can do that. Steve Ott's saying, I've had mixed results with potatoes in grow bags and in raised beds. I'm intrigued by Ruth Stout style. Have you tried? Do you recommend this approach? So the Ruth Stout method, and Ruth typically uses hay. I prefer straw, but it kind of falls into that category of the Back to Eden method, where you're using some organic material on top of the soil, and then you're planting within that. And so the basics of the Ruth Stout method are valid. Mulch on a soil is wonderful. And there are so many benefits. I've made a couple of videos on this. So I love mulching, and I encourage mulching everywhere you're growing plants. They should be mulched. And so the thick layer of hay that Ruth Stout has used gets all the benefits of the mulch. And then the hay breaks down pretty quickly. And so it's adding nutrients back to the soil and helping to sustain the soil life. So yes, it can be beneficial. Where I have issues with the Ruth Stout method, as with so many of these other tips and tricks and suggestions, is it becomes bad advice when you think that the Ruth Stout method by itself is going to make your plants grow better. I've got terrible compacted soil, high in sand. So it's compacted. When the snow melts or when it rains, it runs right through. Less than 1% organic matter, very low in nutrition of all of the important minerals and macro and micronutrients that plants need. So if I were to just put hay or straw or manure or compost or wood chips on top of my soil, it's eventually going to improve the conditions of my soil over time. And that's a big concern I have with Ruth Stout people. Absolutely, be intrigued, look into it more, but be aware that the soil underneath is still the same soil. And unless you amend that soil to begin with, you're going to be waiting a long time, assuming you're starting with worse soil. Then it's going to become a year or two later using the Ruth Stout method. So it's got its good points and it's got its bad points. And so I recommend trying it. I've tried it in different beds and it does okay. But for me, I prefer to just go ahead and amend my soil in my raised beds when I'm growing the vegetables in particular, and then adding an organic mulch on top of that with the straw, the crushed leaves, the dried grass. That's my preferred method because it's easy. I'd already done the work to improve the soil. If I had another area of my garden where the soil was already good, then yeah, I might recommend the Ruth Stout method. And it basically achieves the same thing. It's a thick mulch that breaks down and helps with the soil over time. And a lot of people like the Ruth Stout method because it works for a lot of people. It just isn't necessarily a magic cure unless you start looking at those other components that the plants need, particularly in the soil. Okay, boy, it's amazing how fast our time flies when we're talking about all of these things. I know my comments are about half an hour behind. Simples and Warts is asking, can you give us a rough idea of what your raised beds cost? We're trying to get a handle on the cost of building a wooden bed or wooden raised garden with stealth panels. So I can tell you a couple different approaches. And so in my book, Gardener Scott's Guide to Raised Bed Gardening, which I have linked below, of course, I talk about different types of beds, talk about the different costs, and a lot of it comes down to longevity, the appearance, the size, and what you're looking for in your garden. If you're just looking for a basic wooden raised bed, then you can go to your local home center and buy 3 boards, cut one in half, nail or screw them together, and you've built a raised bed. And in my area, the 2x10, I think that's a good size to begin with. And I like to have 2 levels. So I'll end up buying 6 2x10s. And I think they're around $10 in my area at the store I shop at. So the cost of the material to build the bed for me is about $60. So you would have to go to your source and find out how much a board costs. And then you can figure out how much your bed is going to cost, depending on how many levels you want. And if you just want 1 level, it's 3 boards. If you want 2 levels, it's 6 boards. If you want a higher level, then it's more boards. Where the big cost comes in is filling the bed. And my most popular video is how to fill a raised bed. And I talk about how you put all the different components into the raised bed. And of course, it's the same process I follow in my book. You can fill the bottom half if you have a tall bed with things you don't buy. Because if you buy everything you put into your bed, now the cost skyrockets. So if you're buying the bagged soil and the bagged compost and then the boards at your garden center, you're looking at $300 to $400 per bed. It can get pricey. But if you use the soil you already have, even if it's poor soil, if you add dried grass clippings and the crushed leaves and anything else, if you have access to manure, use manure. There's lots of other things that you might be able to use for free to improve your soil when you're first filling your bed. If you don't have all that stuff and you have to buy, then try to reduce the amount that you have to buy. So use some of your native soil, even if it's bad soil with no nutrients. If you mix in compost, it now becomes good soil. And so you can cut the cost of a brand new raised bed and buy some of the materials with the grand total for me in my area about $100, about 100, maybe 50 if you really want to put more organic matter into the soil that you buy. The trade-off is that's a front-loaded cost. I built my beds 5 years ago now at about $100 per bed because I didn't have all the ingredients yet. I did have to buy some compost when I was first filling the beds. I've remade that cost over and over again. Every year, I grow enough produce in each of my beds to pay back that initial cost of the bed in most cases. So that's a trade-off. Is it worth the cost to put it up front? And then I always recommend starting small. So start with one bed, maybe two, see how much it costs, get your soil started, try to figure out if there's ways that you can save money for the next round of beds. And then the next time, the beds are going to be less expensive. And so the first beds I built were about $100 per bed. Now, prices have gone up since then, so it may be more if you did it the same way I did it. But now when I do raised beds, I have compost that I make myself, and I have organic matter that's in my garden. So I'm able to make my new beds at greatly reduced cost when it comes to the soil, because that can be such a big part of the cost. So when you're building a wooden bed, or like you're asking about a wooden raised garden, the garden, of course, is made up of many, many beds. Start small, particularly if cost is a concern, and then each year add more. And last year I added 3 beds. This year I'll be adding a new area that will have more garden beds. 3 years ago I added beds. 4 years ago I added beds. So I've got a big garden now, but it wasn't a big garden from the beginning. It has grown over time with the gradual increasing of the size of my garden. And that's kind of the way I like to do it. A little bit at a time and a little bit more. Bohemian Herbology says Gardener Scott's book is a spiral raised bed made of stone. Nice. Thank you for that. Yeah. My raised book has got raised beds of all different types. And I show the spiral raised bed that I built at the school garden. And I show how to make an herb garden, or an herb spiral is often what it's called. But thank you for that. Yeah, it was fun to make that as an option. There are so many options when it comes to raised beds. And so if you got a lot of stone, absolutely, you can make a spiral bed with the stone you already have and not pay anything. If you don't want to have sides on it, you can just make a big mound. I got a video on making a hugelkultur mound. It's a raised bed. It sits a good 12 to 15 inches above my ground. And it's a raised bed with no sides to it, because I've just worked on amending the soil and mounding the soil to make a raised bed. I can't grow as many plants in it as I can with a structured raised bed, but I can still use it as a raised bed and get a lot of the benefits. So hopefully that helps. There are lots of different options. I just want to give a shout out real quick to my friends at Greenstock. This last weekend, I did a real quick trip to Knoxville, Tennessee, and visited my friends at Greenstock, along with some other people that you may see on YouTube talking about the trip that we all took to Knoxville, Tennessee, to Greenstock. Such wonderful people. I just love my Greenstock, love the Greenstock people, learned more about the Greenstock. We toured the factory and, of course, got to talk to all the staff. It's a family-run small business, and they're just such wonderful people. I've got a link below to the Greenstock for a couple more days. They're having their St. Patrick's Day sale. So if you've been looking to get a Greenstock in green, their evergreen color, they're all on sale right now at Greenstock, and there will be more sales coming up. So you can click on that link in the description and check out the Greenstock. And if you like the green, I've got a green. That was the second Greenstock I got was green. This is a good time to get the green stocks, is during St. Patrick's Day. So check it out below. So nice to see you all here. I can't believe how fast this goes. Next week, we will be back, and I'll have a guest next week with a topic that I know most of you don't know a lot about, but you'd like to know more about it. So there's the pitch. Come back next week, because it's a new topic that I don't talk about often, but I'm going to have someone who literally wrote the book, and we'll talk about it, and you'll see what it is next Monday. Thanks for being here. I hope you have a wonderful gardening week, even if you're like me with bad weather ahead, do something indoors just to keep that gardening spirit alive. And throughout the whole process, enjoy gardening. I'll see you next Monday.